Tonight, we're covering the historic and pivotal Battle of Midway, one of the most decisive naval engagements of World War II. The Battle of Midway was a dramatic turning point, showcasing remarkable bravery, strategic brilliance, and sacrifice. In June 1942, American forces skillfully halted Japan's powerful naval advance, changing the tide of the war in the Pacific. Its legacy continues to resonate today as a profound example of courage, resilience, and the critical importance of intelligence and leadership in times of crisis. So, before we all get nice and comfortable, take a moment, if you haven't already, to like the video and subscribe to the channel. Also, let us know the time and location from which you are watching. Now, let's get right into our fascinating story, and we hope it helps you learn while you sleep. In the early summer of 1942, the Pacific Ocean stretched vast and blue, its calm surface masking the fierce struggle unfolding beneath the waves and skies above. The United States and the Empire of Japan were locked in a bitter conflict, one that had begun with the devastating attack on Pearl Harbor just 6 months earlier. Japan had stunned the world on December 7, 1941, crippling the American Pacific Fleet in a single, brutal morning. Battleships lay shattered at anchor, aircraft burned on runways, and over 2,000 American lives were lost. But what the Japanese High Command had hoped would be a decisive blow to American resolve only ignited an unyielding determination to fight back. In the months following Pearl Harbor, Japan seemed unstoppable. Their military forces surged across the Pacific, capturing territories with astonishing speed: the Philippines, Guam, Wake Island, and vast stretches of Southeast Asia. The United States, still reeling from its losses, struggled to reorganize and regain its footing. But in the quiet corridors of intelligence offices, a critical advantage was emerging. American codebreakers, working tirelessly behind closed doors, were beginning to unravel Japan's secret naval code, known as JN-25. Led by Commander Joseph Rockefort at Station Hypo in Hawaii, this team of cryptologists and linguists pieced together intercepted radio messages, gradually exposing Japan's next strategic move. By late spring 1942, it became clear that Japan was planning a major attack, one aimed at drawing out and destroying the remainder of America's Pacific Fleet. The target was identified through a clever ruse devised by Rockefort and his team. Suspecting the code name, AF, referred to Midway, a tiny but strategically critical island halfway between North America and Asia, they broadcast a false message indicating that Midway was suffering water shortages. When Japanese communications later reported that AF had water problems, the Americans knew they had cracked the code. Midway Island was a small atoll, hardly visible on a map, yet its position was vital. Whoever controlled Midway could project power deep into the Pacific, threatening enemy supply lines and creating a springboard for future offensives. The Japanese Navy saw it as the perfect lure, an irresistible bait that would force American carriers into a decisive showdown. Once the American fleet was destroyed, Japan could dominate the Pacific unchallenged. Admiral Isoroku Yamamoto, the brilliant strategist who had masterminded Pearl Harbor, now planned this next crucial attack. Yamamoto believed that if the Japanese Navy delivered a crushing defeat at Midway, the United States would lose heart and negotiate peace, allowing Japan free rein across the Pacific. The Japanese assembled the largest naval task force ever put to sea up to that point, centered around 4 powerful aircraft carriers, Akagi, Kaga, Soryu, and Hiryu, along with battleships, cruisers, destroyers, and hundreds of aircraft. Unbeknownst to Yamamoto, the Americans were not walking blindly into his trap. Armed with their newly acquired intelligence, Admiral Chester Nimitz, Commander-in-Chief of the U.S. Pacific Fleet, made a bold decision. He would position his limited forces, 3 aircraft carriers, Enterprise, Hornet, and the hastily repaired Yorktown, to intercept and ambush the Japanese fleet. It was a risky move, but one Nimitz knew had to be made. As May gave way to June, the stage was set for a confrontation that would determine the fate of the Pacific War. Beneath the vast, open skies, 2 mighty naval forces moved toward each other, hidden by distance and uncertainty. The Battle of Midway was about to begin, and its outcome would change history forever. In the final days of May 1942, the Pacific Ocean was deceptively quiet. Beneath its placid surface, however, tension was mounting rapidly. The American naval commanders, led by Admiral Chester Nimitz, waited anxiously for reports from reconnaissance planes and submarines scattered across vast stretches of ocean. Each transmission brought them closer to confirming Japan's exact intentions. On Midway Island itself, life had changed drastically. Once a quiet, remote atoll inhabited by seabirds and a handful of Navy personnel, Midway was now bristling with defenses. Marines had dug trenches, reinforced bunkers, and positioned anti-aircraft guns around the airstrips. The island's airfields hosted fighter planes, bombers, and scout aircraft, their pilots nervously scanning the horizon, knowing an attack could come at any moment. Meanwhile, the Japanese fleet steamed steadily eastward through the Pacific, under the command of Vice Admiral Chuchi Nagumo. His task force included Japan's 4 finest aircraft carriers, Akagi, Kaga, Soryu, and Hiryu, veterans of Pearl Harbor and numerous victorious campaigns. Accompanied by a powerful escort of cruisers and destroyers, the force sailed with the confidence of an undefeated navy. Nagumo's orders were clear: destroy the American presence at Midway and lure the remaining U.S. carriers into a deadly trap. What Nagumo didn't know was that his entire plan had been laid bare to the Americans, thanks to their tireless codebreakers. Admiral Nimitz knew exactly when and where the Japanese strike force would appear. Still, it was an incredibly dangerous gamble. The U.S. Navy remained significantly outnumbered. Admiral Nimitz had only 3 carriers to Japan's 4, and fewer battleships and cruisers. Any mistake could cost America the entire Pacific War effort. As the opposing fleets moved into position, the ocean seemed to hold its breath. On board the carriers USS Enterprise, Hornet, and the recently repaired Yorktown, pilots spent their days meticulously inspecting planes and reviewing intelligence maps. The fate of their country rested on their skill and courage in the air. Men like Lieutenant Commander Wade McCluskey, Lieutenant Dick Best, and Lieutenant Commander John Waldron carefully briefed their pilots, aware of the deadly risks that lay ahead. For sailors below decks, the tension manifested differently. Young men, some barely out of high school, passed time playing cards, writing letters home, or simply staring out over the endless sea, knowing their lives could change dramatically in the next 48 hours. Back on Midway Island, the garrison also waited. Commander Cyril T. Simar, responsible for defending the atoll, did everything he could to strengthen his defenses. Marines checked their weapons repeatedly, engineers laid barbed wire and mines, and aircrews rehearsed quick launch routines. But beneath the preparation lay uncertainty. They knew the enemy was coming, but how soon, and how fiercely? On June 3rd, the long silence broke. An American reconnaissance plane spotted part of the approaching Japanese fleet, reporting back immediately. The report electrified Admiral Nimitz's headquarters. The enemy was finally in sight. Confirmation arrived shortly afterward. Japanese carriers were less than a day's steaming from striking distance of Midway. With the first dawn of June 4th approaching, both sides understood clearly that a decisive moment was at hand. Beneath the darkness, Japanese pilots prepared their bombers and fighters on the carrier decks, their targets carefully studied and memorized. Meanwhile, American radar operators scanned anxiously for enemy aircraft, while pilots sat in their cockpits, engines idling, hearts racing. The stage was set. The long wait was nearly over. In a matter of hours, Midway would erupt into a battle that would determine control of the Pacific and alter the course of history itself. At dawn on June 4, 1942, the stillness over Midway Island was abruptly shattered. Radar operators on the atoll detected an incoming wave of aircraft. Over 100 Japanese fighters and bombers launched from carriers Akagi, Kaga, Soryu, and Hiryu. As alarms sounded, American defenders scrambled into action. Pilots raced to their planes, Marines rushed to anti-aircraft positions, and everyone braced for the inevitable storm. Within minutes, Japanese bombers roared overhead, releasing their payloads. Explosions rocked Midway's airfields and defensive positions, shattering hangars, destroying parked aircraft, and sending smoke spiraling into the morning sky. American anti-aircraft guns opened fire in furious bursts, creating a wall of black smoke and shrapnel in an effort to blunt the assault. Despite their determined resistance, bombs continued falling relentlessly. Meanwhile, a few American fighters managed to take off before the runways became cratered beyond use. Courageous pilots engaged enemy planes in fierce dogfights, weaving through bursts of tracer fire and banking sharply to avoid enemy rounds. Despite their bravery, the defenders were overwhelmed by sheer numbers and superior Japanese aircraft. Yet, every second they fought bought precious time for Admiral Nimitz's hidden carriers to launch their own counterattack. Out at sea, U.S. carrier groups Enterprise, Hornet, and Yorktown received news of the attack on Midway. Immediately, Admiral Frank Jack Fletcher aboard the Yorktown and Admiral Raymond Spruance aboard the Enterprise set their battle plans into motion. The element of surprise was their greatest advantage. Japan still believed the American fleet was far from Midway, unaware of the trap waiting just beyond the horizon. Admiral Spruance made a decisive move, ordering his planes into the air. Within minutes, dozens of American dive bombers, torpedo bombers, and fighter escorts launched from pitching carrier decks, climbing into the brightening sky. These pilots, men who understood clearly the gravity of the moment, flew into uncertainty, hoping intelligence reports had been accurate and that the enemy fleet would be exactly where predicted. Back at the Japanese fleet, Admiral Nagumo was caught in a strategic dilemma. His initial strike on Midway had damaged the island but had failed to destroy its defenses completely. As returning pilots landed, Nagumo debated launching a second strike against Midway or arming his aircraft with anti-ship weapons to engage the rumored presence of American naval vessels. Precious minutes ticked away as crews hurriedly rearmed planes, refueled aircraft, and prepared for the uncertain next move. Then, everything changed. Japanese scouts reported the sighting of American warships, confirming their worst fears: enemy carriers were nearby. Suddenly aware of the immediate threat, Nagumo frantically ordered his bombers to be re-equipped with torpedoes to strike American ships. But this critical decision came at the worst possible moment. Hangar decks became dangerously cluttered with fuel, bombs, and torpedoes, creating volatile conditions aboard each carrier. As Japanese crews scrambled to ready their aircraft, American torpedo bombers, slow, lumbering planes known as TBD Devastators, approached the Japanese fleet at dangerously low altitudes. These brave but vulnerable aircraft were quickly spotted by enemy fighters and anti-aircraft guns. They dove in anyway, launching torpedoes desperately close to the massive ships. Tragically, almost all of these torpedoes missed their targets or malfunctioned entirely. Squadron after squadron was devastated, many shot down, crews lost in fiery crashes into the Pacific. However, the sacrifice of these brave torpedo squadrons was not in vain. Their daring low-level attack had forced the Japanese carriers to maneuver sharply, scattering their defensive formations and leaving their decks crowded and vulnerable. High above, still unnoticed, were the American dive bombers, flying quietly, unseen, ready to seize the critical opportunity that the sacrifice below had created. The Battle of Midway was about to shift dramatically, and the fate of the Pacific would soon hang in the balance. High above the Pacific Ocean, concealed among clouds and morning sunlight, squadrons of American dive bombers searched anxiously for their targets. They had taken off hours before, carefully navigating vast expanses of ocean with only vague intelligence and instinct guiding their path. Fuel gauges were dropping rapidly, anxiety growing in every cockpit, until, at last, they glimpsed the unmistakable shapes of enemy carriers below. Lieutenant Commander Wade McCluskey, leading dive bombers from USS Enterprise, spotted the wakes of Japanese destroyers, thin white lines on the ocean's surface. Following this crucial hint, he guided his formation directly toward the heart of Admiral Nagumo's carrier fleet. At nearly the same moment, dive bombers from the USS Yorktown, led by Lieutenant Commander Maxwell Leslie, approached from a different angle. The Japanese carriers Akagi, Kaga, and Soria lay beneath them, vulnerable and unaware. Their flight decks were crowded with aircraft, fuel lines, and munitions scattered about. Crews were hurriedly preparing planes for combat, oblivious to the imminent threat from above. The sacrifice of the earlier American torpedo bombers had drawn Japanese fighters away to lower altitudes, leaving the sky open for the diving assault. Without hesitation, McCluskey gave the order. "Push over!" American bombers nosed downward, engines screaming, as they plunged from 15,000 feet toward the enemy carriers below. The dive was steep and dangerous. Pilots braced themselves, holding targets steady in their sights as tracer fire and anti-aircraft explosions erupted around them. On board the Japanese carriers, alarms sounded too late. Sailors and pilots scrambled to clear decks, but the American dive bombers were already releasing their bombs with pinpoint precision. Within seconds, the first explosions ripped through the decks of Kaga, setting off catastrophic fires fueled by aircraft, fuel tanks, and scattered munitions. Moments later, Akagi was also struck, its deck shattered by direct hits, explosions tearing apart the ship's interior. Meanwhile, Soria faced an equally devastating fate, bomb blasts quickly engulfing its flight deck in uncontrollable flames. In mere minutes, 3 of Japan's most powerful carriers were transformed into blazing infernos, thick columns of smoke billowing toward the sky. Admiral Nagumo watched helplessly from his flagship as his once formidable carrier force disintegrated before his eyes. For the Americans, the strike was a stunning success, but danger remained. One Japanese carrier, Hiryu, had escaped the initial attack unscathed, hidden temporarily by weather and confusion. The captain of Hiryu, Rear Admiral Taman Yamaguchi, acted swiftly, launching his planes toward the now exposed American carrier USS Yorktown. American radar operators aboard Yorktown quickly detected the incoming attack. Fighters scrambled into the sky, engaging enemy planes in fierce aerial duels. But despite determined defense, several Japanese dive bombers slipped through the American screen, their bombs striking the Yorktown directly. Massive explosions rocked the ship, fires erupting across its deck and hangars. Damage control crews fought desperately to extinguish flames and save the wounded, while sailors worked feverishly to keep the proud carrier afloat. Admiral Fletcher reluctantly ordered Yorktown abandoned, as flames and flooding spread uncontrollably. Yet the battered carrier refused to sink immediately, a testament to its sturdy construction and the courage of her crew. Meanwhile, the other 2 American carriers, Enterprise and Hornet, prepared to retaliate. With Hiryu still posing a deadly threat, the battle was far from over. Pilots quickly rearmed their planes, adrenaline pumping as they readied themselves for another perilous mission. The afternoon sun began descending toward the horizon, its fading light casting long shadows over the Pacific. Both sides braced themselves for another deadly round of combat. The Battle of Midway hung in the balance, and the final reckoning was about to unfold. As the afternoon sun lowered toward the horizon on June 4, 1942, the Pacific sky was filled with smoke trails, debris, and uncertainty. 3 Japanese carriers, Akagi, Kaga, and Soryu, lay burning, mortally wounded, their crews battling desperately to control fires that raged beyond hope. Only one carrier, Hiryu, remained operational, standing defiantly as Japan's last hope in the battle. Rear Admiral Taman Yamaguchi, commanding Hiryu, knew his situation was dire but refused to give in. With remarkable speed and discipline, he launched a second wave of dive bombers, determined to avenge his fallen comrades by striking back at the American fleet. The Americans, aboard USS Enterprise and Hornet, had no illusions about the fight still ahead. The loss of Yorktown was a heavy blow, but victory now hinged on destroying the final enemy carrier. Pilots and crews prepared quickly, refueling and rearming planes, steeling themselves for one more perilous attack. In the late afternoon, Hiryu's aircraft again targeted the damaged but stubbornly afloat Yorktown, mistakenly believing it was a different, undamaged carrier. Japanese torpedo bombers descended toward Yorktown at dangerously low altitudes, dropping their deadly payloads into the water. Despite desperate anti-aircraft fire, 2 torpedoes struck home, sending towering columns of water skyward. Yorktown, already crippled, shuddered under the impacts and began listing severely. Captain Elliot Buckmaster, realizing the damage was catastrophic, issued the painful order to abandon ship for the second time. Sailors lowered themselves into lifeboats and rafts, or jumped directly into the churning waters, watching helplessly as their ships slowly settled lower into the sea. Yet, even as Yorktown struggled, her sacrifice had absorbed Hyria's attacks, leaving Enterprise and Hornet untouched and ready to strike back. As the sun began its descent, Enterprise and Hornet's strike groups launched into the orange-tinted skies, climbing quickly to altitude, scanning the horizon for their elusive target. The pilots understood this was their final chance. Miss Hyria now, and darkness would provide the Japanese carrier cover to escape and fight again. Just before sunset they spotted her, a lone Japanese carrier, defiant yet vulnerable, maneuvering frantically to avoid the impending attack. Without hesitation, the American dive bombers, led by Lieutenant Dick Best from Enterprise, entered steep dives, engines screaming as they hurtled downward. Hyria's defensive guns erupted in a frantic attempt to stop the incoming attackers, but nothing could prevent what came next. Within moments, multiple bombs slammed into Hyria's flight deck, detonating stored ammunition and fuel. Massive explosions tore through the carrier's interior, creating fires and devastation that rapidly spiraled out of control. Admiral Yamaguchi watched in solemn resignation, fully aware that Hyria's end had come. As night fell, the flames aboard Hiryu illuminated the surrounding sea, signaling the final defeat of Japan's proud carrier force. Admiral Nagumo, aboard his cruiser, struggled to accept the scale of disaster. What had begun as an assured victory had turned into catastrophic defeat. For Japanese carriers, proud veterans of Pearl Harbor and months of relentless victory, now burned or lay crippled at the bottom of the Pacific. For the Americans, the Battle of Midway was not yet officially over, but the decisive blow had been struck. Sailors and airmen, exhausted but elated, understood they had just altered the course of the war. Against overwhelming odds, the U.S. Navy had confronted and destroyed the heart of Japan's naval power. Yet, amidst the victory, the human cost was painfully evident. Lives had been lost, ships sunk, and brave men would never return home. As darkness fell over the Pacific, survivors from both sides drifted on rafts or clung to debris, reflecting quietly on a day that had changed history. The battle's fiercest moments had passed, but the story was far from finished. Dawn would bring new challenges, new dangers, and a new realization of just how profound a turning point Midway had become. As darkness enveloped the Pacific Ocean on the night of June 4, 1942, both sides paused to assess the damage and count their losses. The day's fierce fighting had dramatically reshaped the balance of power. For mighty Japanese aircraft carriers, the heart of their naval strength, were either sunk or severely damaged. On the American side, USS Yorktown lay crippled, abandoned, and drifting slowly toward an uncertain fate. Yet, despite the clear American advantage, confusion and uncertainty prevailed. Communication difficulties and incomplete information meant commanders on both sides operated partly in the dark. Admiral Chester Nimitz and his staff anxiously awaited reports from reconnaissance planes, submarines, and scattered naval vessels, piecing together the day's chaotic events. For the Americans, the night brought little rest. Pilots and deck crews aboard Enterprise and Hornet worked tirelessly, repairing damaged aircraft, refueling fighters and bombers, and preparing for potential renewed combat at dawn. Below decks, sailors tried to rest, haunted by memories of friends lost during the brutal daytime engagements. Thoughts of sunken ships and fallen comrades weighed heavily on their minds. Across miles of dark, rolling ocean, Japanese survivors endured their own ordeal. The crews of burning carriers Akagi, Kaga, Soryu, and Hiryu battled desperately against fires and flooding, hoping vainly to save their stricken vessels. But despite their efforts, the situation was hopeless. Slowly, one by one, these once proud carriers succumbed, sliding beneath the waves into the Pacific's depths. Admiral Isoroki Yamamoto, positioned hundreds of miles away aboard his flagship, the battleship Yamato, listened grimly as reports of devastating losses arrived. Yamamoto had staked Japan's strategic future on victory at Midway, and now, faced with catastrophic defeat, he grappled with an agonizing choice: withdraw the remaining fleet or attempt one final, desperate strike. At dawn on June 5, Japanese reconnaissance planes desperately searched for American carriers, hoping to locate and destroy them with surface warships. Yet the Americans, wary of such attacks, had maneuvered their carriers eastward during the night, quietly slipping out of Japanese reach. As morning broke, the grim aftermath of the battle became clear. Search and rescue missions from both sides scoured the sea, plucking exhausted survivors from oil-slicked waters. American crews carefully approached the listing USS Yorktown, determined to salvage the stricken carrier if possible. Damage control teams boarded the ship, working feverishly to stabilize the battered vessel. But danger still lurked beneath the waves. The Japanese submarine I-168 had stealthily slipped through American defenses, carefully observing the crippled Yorktown from periscope depth. Seizing the moment, the submarine fired a salvo of torpedoes. 2 torpedoes slammed into Yorktown, causing catastrophic damage. Another struck the escorting destroyer USS Hammond, splitting the small ship in half. Hammond sank rapidly, taking many sailors down with her, while survivors fought desperately to escape the wreckage. The additional torpedo hit spelled doom for Yorktown. Already severely damaged, the carrier finally succumbed, capsizing and slowly sinking beneath the waves on June 7th, a final victim of the relentless battle. With the loss of Yorktown, American victory came with a sobering reminder of war's cost. Both fleets began withdrawing, each fully understanding the significance of what had just occurred. For Japan, Midway represented a devastating blow, from which recovery would be nearly impossible. For America, it marked a turning point, a hard-won victory that restored confidence and shifted momentum decisively in the Pacific. As the battered fleets returned homeward, the Pacific Ocean stretched quietly behind them, concealing beneath its depths the wreckage of proud ships and the sacrifice of brave men. The Battle of Midway had reached its dramatic conclusion, but its consequences were only beginning to unfold. As the battered ships from both fleets slowly retreated from the Midway battleground, the enormity of what had occurred began to sink in. Far from the atoll itself, on distant shores and naval headquarters, leaders started receiving reports of the battle's outcome, and each side reacted with shock and disbelief. In Tokyo, the Japanese high command was stunned. Admiral Isoroku Yamamoto, architect of the daring attack on Pearl Harbor and strategist behind the Midway operation, accepted full responsibility for the disaster. Though the emperor was shielded from the worst news, the Navy knew the truth: Japan's dominance at sea had been gravely undermined. The sinking of Akagi, Kaga, Soryu, and Hiryu, carriers that had formed the core of Japan's naval aviation power, was not merely a tactical setback. It was a strategic catastrophe. The loss of so many skilled pilots and aircrew members, veterans who had fought with unmatched bravery and skill, would prove devastating in the months ahead. Japan's ability to train replacements quickly was severely limited. Experienced pilots could not be easily replaced, and their absence would be felt deeply in future battles. Meanwhile, in Washington and Pearl Harbor, news of the decisive victory electrified American leaders. President Franklin D. Roosevelt received word with quiet relief, recognizing it as a significant turning point in the war. Admiral Chester Nimitz, who had gambled everything on intelligence reports and the courage of his men, now knew his bold decisions had paid off. Morale soared among American sailors, airmen, and Marines. For the first time since Pearl Harbor, the United States had struck a crippling blow to the enemy, and the Pacific no longer seemed impossibly vast or hopeless. At Midway Island itself, Marines, sailors, and air crews worked tirelessly to repair runways, clear debris, and bury the dead. The battle had left its scars, but there was now a deep sense of pride and determination. They had faced one of the strongest naval forces ever assembled, and emerged victorious. However, the human cost was profound. Hundreds of American sailors and aviators had given their lives. Families back home would soon receive telegrams bearing heartbreaking news. Wives, mothers, fathers, and children grieved quietly in homes across America, mourning the heroes who would never return. Yet despite the losses, the strategic value of Midway was undeniable. With the Japanese fleet's offensive capability crippled, the United States could begin planning a long-term offensive across the Pacific. American commanders started plotting new campaigns to retake lost islands and territory, including Guadalcanal and the Solomon Islands, setting the stage for a methodical advance toward Japan itself. In Japan, the mood shifted from triumph to anxious resolve. The defeat at Midway shook the nation's confidence, prompting internal debates about strategy and resource allocation. Yamamoto, sensing that the strategic initiative had shifted irreversibly to the Americans, privately admitted to his closest aides that Japan might never regain the advantage. The battle's outcome also had profound implications for the wider Allied war effort. British Prime Minister Winston Churchill, upon hearing the news, expressed cautious optimism, recognizing that the Pacific War was far from over. But now, for the first time, victory seemed possible. America's allies were reassured. The U.S. Navy had not only recovered from Pearl Harbor but had dealt Japan a decisive blow, weakening a formidable enemy and bolstering global morale. The ripples of Midway spread far beyond the horizon. Historians would soon come to view it as one of the most significant naval battles in history, an engagement defined by courage, sacrifice, and critical decisions made under immense pressure. For the sailors and pilots who had fought, it was simply a fight for survival. But to history it was the moment when the tide turned. As the smoke cleared, the long road toward ultimate victory in the Pacific stretched before the Allies, paved by the sacrifices of brave men in the waters around Midway. In the aftermath of Midway, the Pacific Ocean slowly returned to a deceptive calm. The vast waters concealed the devastating aftermath: sunken carriers, shattered aircraft, and the final resting places of thousands of sailors and aviators from both sides. Yet beneath the surface tranquility lingered painful memories of sacrifice, bravery, and loss. On the American side, the cost of victory was deeply felt. Families across the nation began receiving telegrams informing them of the deaths of loved ones. The grim reality of war entered homes in small towns and bustling cities alike. Mothers, fathers, wives, and children mourned silently, grappling with the absence of those who would never return. Yet amid grief, pride shone brightly. Their sacrifice had turned the tide against a powerful enemy, restoring hope that victory was indeed possible. One particularly poignant loss was the carrier USS Yorktown, a veteran of earlier battles and a symbol of resilience. Despite the heroic efforts to save her, Yorktown had succumbed to repeated torpedo attacks. Her sinking marked the end of a ship that had endured and survived so much, symbolizing both tragedy and courage. Yorktown's survivors spoke solemnly of lost shipmates, determined to carry forward their legacy. Meanwhile, Japan faced an even more profound reckoning. The defeat at Midway shattered illusions of invincibility that had sustained Japanese morale since the war began. The loss of experienced pilots and skilled naval crews was a blow from which Japan would never fully recover. The psychological impact on both the military and the civilian population was immense. Though initially hidden from the public, rumors and anxiety spread quietly across Japan. For the men who fought at Midway, victory did little to ease haunting memories. Survivors recounted harrowing experiences of flying through walls of anti-aircraft fire, crash-landing damaged planes onto rolling carrier decks, or floating helplessly in open ocean, clinging to debris, wondering if rescue would ever come. Many carried unseen wounds, grappling privately with grief and guilt, wondering why they survived when so many others perished. Yet, even amid this profound sorrow, acts of heroism and humanity shone through. Crews risked their lives to rescue downed aviators, often pulling both friend and foe from the waves. Enemy combatants sometimes found themselves briefly united by the shared struggle to survive at sea, realizing their common humanity even in the depths of war. Back on Midway Island, American defenders returned to rebuilding their shattered defenses. The Marine garrison, pilots, and naval crews understood clearly that the battle they had survived had altered the course of the Pacific War. They were proud, yet subdued, aware that victory had come at great human cost. Memorial services were held quietly, honoring those lost at sea or on distant ships, their bravery never to be forgotten. For Admiral Nimitz, the days following Midway were filled with reflection. Though the battle had been decisively won, he knew many more challenges lay ahead. He immediately began planning the next stage of America's advance across the Pacific, determined to capitalize on this momentum. Nimitz was proud of his sailors, airmen, and Marines, yet he was humbled by their sacrifices. He understood that victory was not an endpoint, but a step forward on a long road. Meanwhile, across the ocean, Admiral Yamamoto faced the bitter reality that his meticulously planned offensive had failed catastrophically. With the loss of 4 carriers and countless experienced aircrews, Japan's dreams of dominance in the Pacific faded into uncertainty. Yamamoto privately admitted to colleagues that the defeat at Midway might have cost Japan the war. The Battle of Midway, though officially over, continued to resonate profoundly. It served as a stark reminder of war's terrible price, balanced only by the courage, sacrifice, and resilience of those who faced it. Both sides had paid dearly, but the Allies emerged with renewed hope, a hope born of sacrifice, a hope that victory was finally within reach. As the months passed after the decisive Battle of Midway, its significance gradually became clear, reshaping the strategic direction of World War II in the Pacific. The victory not only boosted American morale but also provided a critical turning point, ending Japanese naval superiority and opening a path toward ultimate victory for the Allies. In Japan, the truth of Midway was hidden at first. Official reports minimized the disaster, presenting it to the public as a minor setback. But whispers spread rapidly among naval officers and civilian leaders. Many recognized privately that the battle had cost Japan irreplaceable ships, skilled pilots, and confidence. Military strategists now faced a daunting reality. The offensive capability of the Japanese Navy had been severely crippled. Admiral Isoroku Yamamoto, once revered as an invincible strategist, confronted a painful truth. His bold gamble at Midway had backfired disastrously. Yamamoto, who had famously warned before Pearl Harbor that Japan could run wild for 6 months or a year but then would inevitably face difficulty, saw his grim prediction come true. Midway occurred exactly 6 months after Pearl Harbor, marking the beginning of Japan's slow, inevitable retreat across the Pacific. On the American side, Midway became a symbol of resilience and strategic brilliance. Admiral Chester Nimitz, quietly satisfied yet humbled by the heavy cost, emerged as a legendary figure. His careful management of intelligence, bold decisions, and trust in subordinates set a standard for naval leadership. Meanwhile, heroes like Wade McCluskey, Dick Best, and John Waldron were celebrated for their extraordinary bravery, their actions studied in naval academies long afterward. In the wider context of the war, Midway's victory set the stage for aggressive American offensives. With Japanese naval power diminished, American commanders launched ambitious campaigns to reclaim Pacific islands. Just 2 months later, in August 1942, U.S. Marines landed on Guadalcanal, beginning a bitter, months-long campaign. It was the first major offensive action by American forces in the Pacific, made possible by the decisive shift in naval strength at Midway. The psychological effect of Midway also resonated among America's allies. Britain, Australia, and other allied nations gained renewed confidence. They understood that the U.S. Navy had regained its footing and would soon mount sustained offensives against Japanese-held territory. The victory reassured allies worldwide that the United States was fully engaged and committed to winning the war in the Pacific. The victory at Midway also accelerated American industrial efforts. Shipyards, factories, and airfields across the United States ramped up production, replacing lost ships, aircraft, and equipment at unprecedented speed. By late 1943, America would have overwhelming naval and air superiority, made possible in part by the time and momentum bought by Midway. Despite this renewed confidence, survivors of Midway carried deep personal scars. Many sailors, aviators, and Marines struggled silently with traumatic memories. Some spoke little of their experiences, quietly bearing their burdens in private. Yet, they remained immensely proud of their contribution, knowing they had altered the course of history. In the years following the war, historians increasingly recognized Midway as one of the greatest naval engagements ever fought, a battle defined by strategic brilliance, courageous action, and a bit of luck. Its legacy lived on, not only in textbooks but also in popular culture. Films, documentaries, and countless books recounted the epic struggle, ensuring its memory endured. Today, Midway stands as a monument not just to victory but to sacrifice. Memorials and ceremonies commemorate the bravery shown and the lives lost. On the quiet, isolated atoll itself, remnants of the battle remain: rusted weapons, concrete bunkers, and the whispers of history carried by the gentle Pacific breeze. The Battle of Midway, once a fierce struggle between fleets on a vast ocean, became a powerful symbol of turning tides, human courage, and the indelible cost of freedom. Decades after the smoke cleared from Midway's turbulent waters, the battle's echoes continued to resonate deeply. The clash between two mighty naval forces in June 1942 became more than just a pivotal battle. It became a defining moment in military history and a lasting symbol of courage, sacrifice, and strategic ingenuity. Midway's significance as the decisive turning point in the Pacific War was indisputable. Before Midway, Japan had dominated the Pacific, seizing vast territories and threatening the United States and its allies with seemingly unstoppable momentum. After Midway, the tide shifted permanently in favor of the Allies. Japan was forced onto the defensive, losing its initiative and struggling to maintain its shrinking empire. Historians came to view the battle as a remarkable demonstration of the value of intelligence, preparation, and leadership. Admiral Chester Nimitz's bold decision-making, combined with the painstaking code-breaking work of Commander Joseph Rockefort and his team at Station Hypo, became textbook examples of how intelligence and decisive action could alter the course of a war. The American victory was not just strategic, it was deeply psychological. For the U.S., Midway avenged the pain and humiliation of Pearl Harbor. It restored national confidence and demonstrated to the world that America could stand against and defeat the formidable Japanese war machine. The battle helped galvanize American resolve, motivating citizens and industries alike to fully commit to the long and arduous journey to victory. Yet, despite its historical significance, Midway was ultimately a human drama, a story of ordinary men who faced extraordinary circumstances. Pilots who took off from carrier decks knowing they might never return. Sailors who battled fires, floods, and exhaustion to save their ships and shipmates. Marines who held fast on Midway Island against overwhelming attacks, refusing to yield. Their stories, both heroic and heartbreaking, formed the core of Midway's legacy. On the Japanese side, Midway became a somber reminder of the perils of overconfidence, miscalculation, and strategic rigidity. Admiral Yamamoto, Japan's brilliant but ultimately tragic commander, foresaw the dangers inherent in confronting the industrial might and resolve of the United States. His defeat at Midway vindicated those fears. Japan's naval leaders grappled with the bitter consequences of lost ships, irreplaceable pilots, and shattered confidence. After the war, both nations sought closure. Veterans from both sides returned to the isolated atoll decades later, meeting as old men who had once been fierce enemies. Handshakes, quiet conversations, and mutual respect replaced memories of combat. They came to honor fallen comrades, recall shared experiences, and to find peace on the waters that had once witnessed such violence. Today, Midway remains a quiet, remote place, marked by rusting guns, crumbling bunkers, and memories lingering among the seabirds that call it home. Its preserved battlefields and monuments stand as silent witnesses to history, visited by generations who seek to understand the enormity of the sacrifice made there. Midway's story also lives on in classrooms, books, and films, teaching future generations not only the lessons of warfare but also the importance of courage, resilience, and careful leadership. It is a testament to how human decisions, large and small, can shape history. Ultimately, the Battle of Midway endures not simply as a tale of strategic victory but as a lasting tribute to those who fought and died in its turbulent waters. Their courage transformed despair into hope, defeat into triumph, and set the stage for freedom to prevail. As time moves forward, Midway remains etched in memory, a powerful reminder of sacrifice, bravery, and the enduring spirit of those who fought to preserve peace. The battle is over, yet its story continues, carried forward by the quiet voices of history. whispers from the past, echoing across the endless Pacific.